Beyond the Gates spoilers tease that the truth is less a sharp blade and more a slowly unraveling fray of threads, the kind that, once pulled, reveal not a tidy knot but an entire tapestry of motives, loyalties, and small betrayals that feel at first like nothing more than a carelessly dropped stitch. In the days after Doug's death, those threads began to tangle around Vanessa and Donnell until neither of them could tell where grief ended and accusation began. Vanessa's confession, the one that smelled of wine and apology, of months of hesitation and the brittle weight of secrecy, landed with the force of a dropped object in an empty house, startling, echoing, impossible to ignore. "I leaned on Joey," she said, the words modest as a dare. Donnell heard it with the odd double ears of a son who had already spent nights interrogating the last light in his father's eyes. The confession didn't explain everything, but it opened a seam. What Vanessa meant when she said she had relied on Joey was as layered as the small motel receipts that had once seemed unimportant until someone else told the story differently. Joey had not simply been a friend to Doug, he was perhaps a bright, temporary distraction. To Vanessa he had been a lifeline when Doug's temper became a low-grade weather system that never cleared. She had leaned on Joey for the simple things at first, help with the car, an ear when Doug drank too much, and then for things that were less simple, decisions, arguments that she had to have but knew would end poorly, a quiet reminder that she could leave a room before words struck home. The confession implied more than physical dependence, it implied that Vanessa had let Joey become a fulcrum, a place to set anxiety and shift it, to move it away from Doug and onto someone who seemed smaller and therefore less dangerous. Donnell's response was not immediate. He had already been living inside a loop of blame, running scenes backwards like an out-of-sync film. The memory of the night, the phone call, the late dash to the hospital, the ache of arriving too late had become a fixed lens in his mind. He had accused himself in private ways that were small and exacting. If he'd answered the call sooner, if he'd left the house earlier, if he'd asked the right question when Doug had chuckled one last time. His grief had sharpened into an obsession with the mechanics of fate. Did Doug's death belong to chance, or to a sequence of choices that could, if rewound, be altered? When Vanessa admitted to relying on Joey, Donnell heard something else, not only betrayal but the suggestion that Doug's last months contained fights that he, as a son, had never been privy to. Vanessa's voice broke when she spoke because she understood that the secret wasn't her own anymore, it was a blade that could cut her son and the memory of his father. The police involvement added a new, colder clarity. Jacob, the kind of investigator who wore patience like a coat, had requested the casino footage from the night Doug left the tables. It should have been simple, cameras that recorded in neat loops, time-stamped evidence of a man's last movements. But nothing in this case wanted to be simple. Joey had interposed himself into that small chain of custody like a human eraser. He had delivered footage, nodded politely, and smiled in a way that suggested the world always went his way. Unbeknownst to Donnell and Vanessa, the clip Jacob watched had been trimmed, a small but deliberate act that removed Marcel from the seat next to Doug. Where Marcel had once existed in the frames, a few pixels of presence were gone, as if the night had been edited to protect a secret or a person. Joey's theft of presence was not merely technical. It was a moral erasure that kept certain responsibilities from being seen. By the time Donnell demanded to review the footage himself, Joey had a ready answer: the camera had been malfunctioning. It was a casual, practiced lie, the kind a man tells when he has rehearsed excuses for long enough that their edges are soft. "It must have glitched," Joey said, shrugging in that performative way he had when he wanted sympathy. Donnell wanted to believe the camera, because if the tape was whole and if Marcel had been at Doug's side, then there was someone else to blame. Grief would no longer be an intimate, private failing. If the footage was missing, the blame reverberated inward. Marcel's presence or absence mattered because he was not merely a background figure. He moved through scenes like a shadow that belonged to someone else's light. Calm, almost clinical in his reserve, he sat in the back of the station as others paced and talked. People who watched him saw only a man who did not flinch, a man who had the eerie peace of someone who had made deals with fate long ago. Marcel's composure was unnerving because it suggested that he knew things others did not, or worse, that he had accepted whatever would come. He advised Donnell, with a dryness that bordered on cruel care, not to look too hard for answers. "Not everything you find will help," he said, "and some things hurt less when they remain unknown." It sounded like compassion until it sounded like threat, a warning that too much truth would not set anyone free, only make them bleed more. Jacob, though, was not satisfied with the easy answer. He kept watching Marcel the way a fisherman watches a buoy for the first telltale dip. Suspicion, once planted in Jacob's mind, did not grow into hysteria, it grew into a slow, methodical curiosity. He began to follow Marcel's small shadows, to the diner where the man ate alone, to the alley where he smoked, to the cheap apartment above a bar where the lights never went out. Jacob's surveillance was quiet and careful because he understood the difference between proof and gossip. He wanted footage, receipts, a path that connected someone to the night Doug died. Each time he thought he'd find it, someone, Joey, perhaps, or the way files had been delivered, made the path less clear. After the formalities at the police station, Vanessa sought Joey not in the way a lover seeks a hiding place but in the way of someone seeking ballast. She wanted to feel leaned on, to have someone who could carry the weight of her fractured explanations. Joey was there, not by accident but by design. He presented himself as stable, which, in his case, meant he had carefully calibrated what parts of himself to display. He wanted to be the center of gravity for a woman in distress, to be the person who could, with a word or an embrace, to Vanessa, who had been dragged through public sorrow and private accusation, his arms offered respite, a place to breathe, to let the face of her husband be heavy and to let someone else hold the tension. That moment, however, collapsed into betrayal in the space of a few steps. Donnell and Jacob, who had reasons to circle the precinct and the nearby blocks, happened upon the sight of Vanessa in Joey's arms. It was a small, vertical tableau of domestic intimacy made painful by its timing. Donnell saw his mother leaning into another man and felt the world hinge. It was not only that Vanessa had sought comfort, it was that she had done so in a way that suggested a history he had been denied. The sight of his mother with Joey pierced him, not because of the embrace itself, but because it complicated the narrative he had been rehearsing. The man who'd held his father's hand at the hospital was being replaced, in a single image, by someone else. Anger did not immediately become words, it was a slow, rising current that brought to the surface older resentments, all the moments Doug had been absent, all the times he had let anger carry him away. Donnell wanted an explanation that would align the world back into a shape he recognized. Vanessa's reaction was a mosaic of shame and fervent denial. She startled, breath caught, and was already reaching for a language of absolution. She could have told the truth, that Joey had become a shelter she crept into without telling her son, that she had love and fear woven together in small, messy places. But truth, particularly in grief, is a risky currency. It buys little and can bankrupt relationships. She stood there, caught in a human equation she had not wanted to solve in public. Would she confess fully that she and Doug had argued over Joey, that resentment had threaded between them, or would she smooth the edges and say something that would make the sight less sharp? Her choice in that instant would be measured in long-term consequences. A confession could dismantle her son's last memories of his father, while a lie could bubble up like poison later. Joey, meanwhile, practiced a brand of damage control that had been part of his repertoire for years. He could be charming, quick with a conspiracy of explanations that displaced attention. He whispered reassurances to Vanessa about how it must look and how she didn't owe anyone anything. His voice had the seductive quality of a man who knows how to redirect guilt. He offered to stay, to be a presence at the funeral, to be the sympathetic listener when Donnell needed to rage. He positioned himself as ally and stabilizer, two roles that had the potential to erode the rawness of grief if they were allowed to, and to mask culpability if they had to. The question of culpability returned, shifting, to Drake. Joey's maneuvering had a purpose beyond misplaced loyalty. He needed to channel suspicion away from people who mattered to him. Drake was a convenient target. Small, jittery, someone whose life had been laced with poor choices. Drake fit perfectly into the narrative of guilt that Joey could manufacture on demand. If Drake could be induced to take blame, The messy edges that connected Marcel to the accident might be hidden under a simpler, more digestible explanation, that a reckless driver, or a frightened pawn, had caused the crash. Drake's reaction to being summoned to the station was exactly the kind of trembling fear that made him believable. He arrived with that posture, hands slightly too polished, eyes that never settled. When Jacob questioned him, he flatly denied knowing Doug. He told a small lie that he had been fired after an incident related to Doug's death, which in itself was an evasive dance. His story had been prepared in a panic, a half-formed alibi that could collapse with a single precise question. In front of the detectives he was less a person than an answer someone else wanted to hear. Drake's fear was raw because he did not know Marcel's part in the accident. He only knew that men like Joey had power in their showing and silence in their threatening. Joey, adept at coercion thinly disguised as concern, offered Drake protection in exchange for a confession. The terms were not merely promises but the subtle, suffocating pressure of a man who knew the exact nervous system to press. He suggested scenarios in which Drake's admission would spare them all, himself included, from the messy truth. "Just say something," Joey urged, the tone of a man who knows how to shepherd panic into something useful. "Tell them you were there. Tell them you panicked. That will end it." The offer was both mercy and manipulation. Confess and reduce the inquiry to a neat, solvable problem. Refuse and watch the net tighten around everyone Joey cared for. Drake, cornered and cowardly, considered the bargain as a tiny man might consider a large, looming storm shelter, with the desperate belief that the door will hold if one is willing to close it. He lied again, stating he did not know Doug in any personal way, indicting himself for one thing while denying knowledge of another. It was a weak confession that served someone else's purpose more than his own. He thought it would exonerate him by making him small and therefore less interesting. It would assign him a role easily dispensable in a larger plot. Jacob, though, was not impressed by moral theatrics. He had seen confessions made under duress that turned out to be convenient smokescreens. He wanted facts that could be corroborated. If Drake had been anywhere near Doug's final hours, there would be traces, CCTV not yet scrubbed, phone logs, a gas receipt, a name that repeated on a bartender's tongue. Jacob wanted to keep Drake close, not because he trusted the man but because he understood that confessions bought under pressure sometimes smelled like lies. He was cautious, he was patient, he suspected that a confession that neatly closed the window on a case that had too many open edges was actually the moment the case opened up further. "Stay," Jacob said. "You can help. You can tell us everything." The request was gentle but firm, the kind that keeps doors open while also putting weight behind them. All of this unfolded while Marcel observed with a detachment that trenched at the edges of patience. His placid face did not soften when people around him unraveled. If anything, it grew more abstract, like someone contemplating a painting while a room burned. People guessed at why he sat so calm. Had he been at the wheel that night? Had he been an accessory? Or was he only a man who had learned not to let the world's pressures ruffle his coat? The answers were elusive because his life had been constructed in layers of silence. Marcel's habits, a particular brand of cigarettes, the way he left tips that were never exact, were small clues. Jacob slowly began to assemble them, not in a way that blamed, but in a way that asked a question. Who benefits from Doug's disappearance from the public record? The possible answers multiplied when a rumor made the rounds, that Joey might be willing to do anything to protect those he loved or those who served his ends. The rumor did not say outright that he would kill for the sake of erasing an inconvenient witness, but it left the impression like a bruise spreading slow, inevitable, menacing. The danger of such a man is not only that he has the capacity for violence but that he can persuade others that violence is the most rational path. The thought of Joey trying to silence Drake did not arise from nothing, it came from a pattern of behavior. He had already altered footage, had already offered to be a shoulder where that shoulder might actually be a handover to a darker thing. As evening closed and the station's fluorescent lights hummed their tired hum, the characters moved like pieces on a board where no one had chosen the colors. Donnell's demands for truth grew teeth. He wanted to see the footage, to peel back time and watch his father's last hours as if that act alone could stitch something back together. Vanessa stood between confession and concealment, swayed by the twin urges to shield her son from further harm and to keep her own heart intact. Jacob prowled the edges, patient and suspicious. Marcel sat like some quiet god of the small, the man who had knowledge and chose silence. Joey moved with the practiced ease of someone used to engineering outcomes. Drake trembled like a small animal hearing an unfamiliar sound at dusk. The narrative shifted toward its most dangerous seam when Joey suggested to Drake, in a tone that contained both comfort and calculated insistence, that a confession would be the end of it. Drake, naive and terrified, agreed to go along with a story that would make him the fall guy. But that agreement was fragile. In the world they inhabited, people who confessed under pressure often regretted their words. Lies have a way of unraveling. If Drake spoke and the truth still waited in the corners in a camera that had been repaired or in a witness who remembered too clearly, then the cell of deceit would begin to fracture. The consequences of such a fracture would not remain private. They would ripple outward like a stone dropped into a previously still pond. The last scene before everything tipped further into danger was a tableau of small intimacies. Vanessa, her face hollowed by the weight of secrets. Donnell, his eyes raw with a hunger for what had been withheld. Jacob, focused and implacable. Joey, all warmth and acute intent. Marcel, composed and inscrutable. Drake, a small man about to be asked to speak for a crime he did not fully understand. The lines between protectors and perpetrators had already blurred. What should have been straightforward footage, witnesses, motive had become a map of detours. As night thickened and the station emptied, the quiet that settled was not the peacefully kind. It was the kind that sits before a storm, the unmoored silence of people poised to take steps they will probably regret. Outside, a street light buzzed. Inside, someone, perhaps Joey, made a phone call. The dialogue that would follow on that line could tilt everything: a demand, a threat, a promise, the final piece to close or to expose an old wound. Donnell, still thinking in loops, did not yet know whether his next move would be to forgive, to accuse, or to break something irretrievable. Vanessa, clutching a life that had been rearranged by grief and small betrayals, could only hope that truth, if it came, would not be too late. And Drake, trembling at the edge of choice, had to decide whether to speak into the light or to fall silent and hope someone else carried the weight.